Chad Daybell's trial is underway. We started with opening statements today in the beginning of the presentation of evidence, and we're going to be breaking down really the opening statements in today's video. And we're going to be understanding a little bit the theme and what we can expect for this trial, to what the evidence is going to show. So, what are opening statements for? Well, if you go by the book, opening statements are just simply a roadmap. It's just to let the jury know what you expect the evidence to show. So if you're the prosecutor, you explain to the jury what you expect the evidence to show that's going to prove your case. If you're the defense, you tell the jury what you expect the evidence to show that's going to show that your client is not guilty. So that's if you just do it by the book. But every lawyer, every good lawyer, is always thinking of a way to advocate for their client. And sometimes that looks like a closing argument. And you give the jury some strong arguments about why you win, right? That's what closing arguments are for. But opening statements are not for closing arguments. If you get up there and you try to argue your case to the jury, you're going to be cut off by either the opposing attorney or the judge. So that is not what opening statements are for. Nevertheless, there is still an art and a science in how to present facts in a way that is favorable to your side. And there's a way to do it. And this is what you have to think about as a lawyer, how to present the facts in a way and present just saying facts, saying evidence in a way that's going to help your case. So that is what a good attorney will try to do. And another part that an opening statement is for, one of the main parts, is especially if you go first. If you're the prosecutor or if you're the plaintiff in a civil case and you're going first, you're speaking to the jury first, you have to anticipate what the other side's arguments are going to be. And when you anticipate what the other side's arguments are going to be, then you can present it in a way to the jury that's going to be favorable to your client. There's very rarely a really slam dunk case where you have all the evidence on your side and the defense really has nothing to say. They're going to have something. Generally speaking, they're going to have some sort of defense, some sort of argument to be made. And they're going to have some decent points on their side. So you don't want the jury to hear it for the first time from the defense attorney when he gets up there. Or if you're in a civil case, from the defense attorney in your civil case. You want the jury, especially when you're going first, to hear all of the evidence that's going to come out in this case in a light that's favorable to your client. And in this case, the prosecution will be in the light that's favorable to the state or to getting a conviction. So you have to anticipate and dispel. That's called anticipate and dispel the arguments. And you do it again. You don't argue it. You do it in a way that you're just talking about the facts of the case. So that is a very important part. Now, I'll tell you something interesting, actually, that a prolific trial attorney told me once. And he said this is the way that he does his opening statements. He said he advocates as much as he can during opening statements until either the judge cuts him off and says, you have to stop this because you're making this into an argument, or the other side objects. And if the other side doesn't object and the judge doesn't get involved, I'll just make as many arguments as I can during my opening statements. Because that's what he believes his job is. He's going to push the rules and bend the rules as much as he can in order to advocate for his client. So that is one approach. I don't necessarily agree to breaking the rules, but there is an art and a science to presenting simple facts and evidence in a way that's favorable to your client. So that's one part. Another part, which I always talk about, is that you have to talk about the burden of proof. You have to talk about what your burden is. If you're the prosecutor or if you're the plaintiff, you have to, especially in a criminal case, you have to embrace the burden. You have to tell the jury you're not intimidated by this burden. As a prosecutor, you embrace it and you have no problem with it. And at the end of the case, you're going to see how I have satisfied my burden. And if you're the defense, you've got to get up there and show how incredibly high this burden is. And even if the jury is convinced of something, but if you have one reasonable doubt, then you're not allowed under the law to write guilty on that verdict form. So you have to stress that in your opening statements, and you have to stress it in the closing arguments, and you have to stress it in jury selection in case you haven't heard that yet. You always have to stress this if you're the defense attorney. And if you want to see a good example of what you're supposed to be doing during opening statements about stressing the burden of proof, you can go check out the YNW Melly opening statements by the defense. It was pretty short, but and I gave a whole analysis on the opening statements. You can check that out too. But the way that the attorney talked about the burden of proof and beyond a reasonable doubt, I thought that was very good. So that's something you can check out. And now, with these ideas and what you're supposed to be doing during opening statements, now we can jump into the prosecutor and defense attorney's opening statements, and we'll see if they followed my advice. Now, another thing that you have to do during opening statements, and it's something that's very helpful, is that what do people love to listen to? What do people like listening to? Aside from Brother Counsel's analysis. But what does a general person like to listen to? They don't like to listen to facts. They don't like to listen to laws. These things are boring to many people. But what people like listening to is a story. So if you can turn your opening statement into a story, that is a great approach so that the jury will actually listen to you. And if you can sprinkle in some evidence that's going to help your side and sprinkle in a little bit of advocacy here and there, the jury's listening. And since it becomes part of the story, it can fit much better with them. It can sit much better with them as well, your side of the story, before the defense attorney even gets up. And you could have already have such a strong influence with the jury at that point that you could have already made such leeway with the jury and improving your case. All right, so that is another part. Now, with that understanding, it was interesting that the prosecutor in this case started off in a way that he portrays a story. He says it, and he even breaks it down into chapters. And the poetry in this is that Chad was an author, and he wrote books. So here is the book, the story of this trial, and he breaks it down into different chapters. And it was a nice theme. I thought it was a nice spin on how to present his opening statement. I thought it was a nice job. So let's jump into what he says here. So he actually starts off very, very nicely. He starts off very strong before he gets into the whole story. But chapters, and breaks it down into chapters. He starts off by saying, look what we got here. We've got September 2018. We have 2 dead children, or 2 missing children, which are eventually found dead. A month later, we have Chad Daybell's wife, who was murdered, found dead in her bed, which was determined to be a homicide. 17 days later, he's off in Hawaii getting married to this new love interest, Lori Vallow. Well, she wasn't really so new, but he's off getting married 17 days after his wife of 29, 30 years dies. What more do we really need to say? Right? That really paints the entire picture here. 2 kids dead, wife dead, 17 days later, you're off in Hawaii getting married. That doesn't look so great, right? Okay. Well, then he continues with the another theme, and he says that this case is really about 3 things: sex, money, and power. And that was also, by the way, how the prosecutor started off in Lori Vallow's trial, that this case is all about sex, money, and power. And you're going to see a lot of that during the text messages. Apparently there's something like 14,000 text messages between Lori Vallow and Chad and some other people. And you're going to be seeing some of the text messages between Lori and Chad, and they are very graphic at some of them about what exactly they were doing with each other. So we have that. We have some text messages about the money and the power. Okay, so you're going to be seeing a lot of that. Then he actually goes into more of the story about what happened here. So you have Chad, who is an author. He talks about things like the apocalypse. He's a religious author, and he seems like an ordinary man. He seems like he has a family. He's married, 1 woman, his whole life, married to her for a very long time, have 6 children. I mean, like, looks like a regular, ordinary man. And now let's take a look at Lori. Lori Daybell was married to 4 different men. Her last husband was Charles Vallow, and they had 2 children. So they weren't biological children, but they had 2 children. One of them was Tylee Ryan. Tylee Ryan was Lori's child from a previous marriage, and she was 16 years old, 16-year-old teenager. And you had J.J. Vallow, who was a 7-year-old child with on the spectrum for autism, and he needed some extra help. So, and this was not a biological child of Lori and Charles. It was a child that they adopted. I think it was a nephew. So you have these 2 children who are with Lori and Charles. And now, October 26, 2018, that is the fateful day in which Chad meets Lori. and they meet at a religious conference. And that's when this affair begins. Now, for Lori, it's a little bit more understandable, this affair, right? She's already been married. I don't want to say understandable. Nothing's ever understandable, but if you'd have to guess which one of these people are more likely to engage in an affair, you would probably guess Lori. This is her fourth husband. Doesn't seem like she can settle down with anybody for too long, and seems like she's always looking for the next guy. So you got Lori, and then you also have Chad, but Chad doesn't seem so much the person to engage in an affair. He's a guy that's been married for 29 years. He has a family, 6 children. Well, anyway, they meet at this conference, and that's when they start this affair. Now, in order to excuse this affair, what are you going to do? I mean, you got these supposedly religious people, and they're engaging in an affair. So how do you excuse that? So what they came up with, and I'm not sure whose idea this was yet, but what they came up with seems like it's more Chad's idea, that really they were really married in a previous lifetime. So this is one of the religious ideas that either Chad writes about or he believes in, that they were actually married. They were actually married in a previous lifetime, died, and then came back again as in these new bodies, and now they married other people, and now they're meeting each other again, and that's why they're allowed to have this affair, even though they're both married, because really, technically, they are or were married previously in a previous lifetime. So their names, for some reason, they have to change their names also to James and Elena. So they changed their names to James and Elena, and that was their past names in their previous lifetimes, and now they were reincarnated in a new body, and now they're meeting again. So that's the idea how they're able to engage in this affair. Then you also have these other writings and text messages you're going to hear about some people being dark, labeled as dark, people being zombies. And these are essentially concepts in which a person can be overtaken by an evil spirit, and they can just turn dark and religiously. And they can even get so bad that the people actually turn into zombies. And there's this casting in which how a person perhaps can get cured from this dark or from this zombie state by casting out the evil spirits, something like that. And anyone who stood in their way, all of a sudden, would be marked as dark and zombies. And they talked about obstacles, that they had these obstacles in their way of having what they wanted to be in their relationship, these obstacles. All right, now we also get introduced to Alex Cox. Alex Cox is Lori's brother. And Alex Cox seems to have been very loyal to Lori, and this is what the prosecution says, and has done certain favors for Chad and Lori, such tremendous favors that Chad has told Alex that really they have no way of even repaying him for some of the favors that he's done. And at some point, Alex gets afraid that Alex is going to be the fall guy for some of the activities, some of Chad and Lori's activities. And in December 2019, he dies. Now, his wife is going to testify. So Alex Cox's wife is going to testify, and she's going to testify about his fears, about being their fall guy. So we're going to be hearing about that. Now, Lori's husband, Charles Vallow, was shot by Alex Cox. That is true. So what he was afraid of being pinned on, what exactly was being pinned on, that was clear that Alex did shoot Charles. So not exactly a very innocent person who's just sitting there and afraid that someone's going to point the finger at him. Well, anyway, Charles is Lori's husband, and Charles gets shot by Alex. And Lori thought at the time that she was actually the beneficiary for his $1 million life insurance policy. So Charles had a $1 million life insurance policy, and Lori thought that she was the beneficiary of that. And guess what happens after Charles is murdered by Lori's brother? Just so happens that Charles took her off as the beneficiary of his life insurance policy. So she does not get $1 million. Oh, well. Well, Lori texts Chad that, don't worry. I mean, exactly what the context of the exact wording of the text messages, we don't know. But she does text Chad that she's still going to be able to get $4,000 from Social Security. What are the $4,000 from Social Security? Well, the $4,000 has to do with the two children that because of Charles' death, so you have JJ and Tylee, who she's going to be receiving money from Social Security for them. So she's still getting $4,000 from them. Then all of a sudden, Tylee is labeled as dark, and she goes missing. Tylee Ryan's remains were later found charred and dismembered on Chad's property. But did that stop Lori from receiving Social Security benefits? No, she just continued cashing those checks and using that money that she was getting for Tylee Ryan. JJ was also found dead due to suffocation. And still, during that entire time when he went missing, she was still continuing to cash those checks from Social Security for him. Then we have Tammy Daybell. Tammy Daybell first reports that she was shot at near her home by someone. And then, what do you know, 10 days later, after she was shot at, she's found dead in her bed. And also, just another coincidence, is that her life insurance policy was raised to $400,000 right before she is found dead in her bed. Really interesting coincidence. And then what happens? Very soon after her death, after Tammy's death, Chad cashes in the life insurance plan and begins looking for a condo in Hawaii. And on one of the rental applications, he puts in that this is a couple, him and Lori, looking for a condo, and they have no kids. Now, this is before anyone knew anything about the kids. Not they knew anything, but before the kids were even discovered or anything. So did he know already that the kids were not around? All right. Well, that's what he puts on the rental application. Now, the medical examiner you're going to hear, this is what the prosecution says, the medical examiner you're going to hear said that the only explanation for Tammy's death is homicide. There's no other explanation. Not only that, but Chad predicted that Tammy would die early. So somehow he had this sense that she was going to die early. Then, following this, Lori is looking for wedding rings. Actually, whilst Tammy was still alive, they end up getting married in Hawaii, and then there's some investigation that begins because of Lori's nephew, who gets shot at from Tylee's Jeep, and that leads down one avenue of investigation towards Tylee. And then you also have J.J. Vallow's grandmother, who asked law enforcement to get involved to find out where J.J. Vallow was. And that's where these two investigations took, where they eventually led to Chad's property, where they found these two bodies. Now, something also interesting that the prosecution pointed out in their opening statement is that the day after the two children go missing, Chad texts Tammy that he shot a raccoon and buried it in their pet cemetery on their property, and that he had a fire on the property where he burned some debris. So, interesting text when one of the children was found charred and burned. I think that was Tylee, and JJ was found suffocated. And the next day is when Chad is texting that he shot a raccoon, buried it in the pet cemetery, and that he had a fire on the property. All right, so that was the prosecution's opening statement. Not one word about the burden of proof. I think that was a mistake. Always got to talk about burden of proof with the prosecutor. And we're going to hear some things in the defense attorney's opening statement, which I was also surprised that the prosecutor did not address in his opening statement. So the defense opens up that, number one, you shouldn't be distracted by speculation or guessing. That's not what you should be concentrating on. You should be concentrating on the facts and the evidence in this case, and that's it. And then he starts talking about the relationship that Tammy had with Chad. So they dated for 6 months. They got married. They had 6 kids. Tammy ran the publishing company. He writes that Chad wrote a lot about religion, and they're mostly fiction. And he also wrote about premonition, which is the ability to see in the future, to see what's going to happen. Now, in October 2018, he was invited to speak about his books, and that's when Lori met him. And the way that the defense attorney paints this picture is that Chad was just sitting by a booth selling books. And now Lori comes up. Lori, who is a former Miss Texas contestant, a very attractive woman, knows her way with men, and she starts coming on to Chad. This wasn't Chad's doing. This was Lori's doing. And this is how the defense attorney is presenting this. She was very attractive, and she was very manipulative. And yes, they did speak at that conference. They got to know each other. And then he says that about a month and a half, 2 months, there was no contact really between Lori and Chad. Not that it makes so much of a difference, because we know that they did end up in an affair. Now, still, even though that they ended up in an affair, the defense attorney explaining that this is really all Lori. Lori was married 4 times. Now, aside from Lori being this very attractive and manipulative woman, you have her crazy brother, her nutcase brother, Alex Cox. And this is how the defense is portraying it, as he should. Alex Cox felt like the typical, and I shouldn't say typical, but the older brother type, who's going to take care of his sister. And he's his sister's protector. And he would do anything for her, anything. In fact, Alex tased Lori's 3rd husband, tased him. And also, Alex shot Lori's 4th husband, Charles. And there's no dispute about that. Alex shot him. And he finished him off at point blank range. A very brutal murderer. And there's no indication at all that Chad was involved in that murder at all. He's not being charged with that murder. So you see already that this guy, Alex Cox, is a nutcase. He's a murderer. And he'll do anything to protect Lori, or anything that Lori wants. So you got Lori, who's this manipulative person. You got Alex Cox, who is her crazy brother. And that's a recipe for disaster. Whoever they come into contact with, what do you think is going to happen? Disaster is going to follow. So that's one strong point that the defense makes. Another part is that when you think of Chad Daybell's backyard having these bodies in them. Now remember, these aren't his children. These are Lori's children. They're not biological children, but, well, Ryan is, but I'm sorry, Tylee Ryan is, but JJ wasn't. But these are Lori's children. Now they're in Chad's backyard. Now you would think, okay, backyard is like, you go outside to your backyard. That's where the children are buried. No, this is a 4.5 acre farm. So the defense attorney wants to point out that this is a very huge property. And it could be they just, essentially, he doesn't say this, but the idea is that, who knows why they picked his property. I mean, they picked his property because it's just so big, and they just found an easy place to hide the bodies, and really Chad had nothing to do with it. It's not like someone's digging in your backyard right outside your door. Also, a DNA expert is going to say that there was no DNA of Chad on JJ or Tylee. So there's no DNA from Chad on those bodies. Now, another expert is going to say, listen to this, that she can't determine what the cause of death for Tammy Daybell was. Well, isn't that interesting? The prosecutor said in his opening statement that the medical examiner is going to say that the only explanation to Tammy Daybell's death is homicide. And here you have the defense attorney saying that his expert is going to say that no, we don't know. Not that it wasn't a homicide, but it's not definitely a homicide. It's undetermined. That this expert can't determine it. And it seems, from what the defense attorney was saying, is that this is a very renowned expert. This is a renowned expert who said that it's not so clear that it was a homicide, that Tammy Daybell's was a homicide. And also, number 2, is that Tammy Daybell's children are going to testify And they're going to testify that she was suffering from a number of different maladies, different sicknesses, and that she refused to see a doctor. And on top of that, she was taking all these alternative medications and these herbs and rubbing these things on herself. And that's how seems like she would self-medicate. So that should give you some pause about whether Tammy Daybell's was a murder or not. Now, when I heard this, I'm watching this and I'm hearing this, and by the way, fortunately the video and the audio is not so great in this trial, but that's how the judge apparently wants to do it. I'm watching this, and I can't believe the prosecutor didn't address this. Why wouldn't you address this? This is such an important part of the case. You just said in your opening statement, you could completely lose some credibility with the jury. Now, the jury can say, okay, that's your case and this is the defense's case. But if you have the opportunity, you're going first. You know, as the prosecutor, I assure you, you know about this expert because there had to have been disclosed. You got the report. You know that the defense is going to say that they have an expert that's going to say that Tammy Daybell's death was not necessarily a homicide, that it's undetermined. If you know that, then you have to tell that to the jury when you're the prosecutor and spin it whatever way you can. So, for example, let me give an example. Let's say I'm the prosecutor. Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear expert testimony from the medical examiner in this case. And the medical examiner is going to say that the only explanation is a homicide. Now, the defense hired and paid a lot of money to an expert to look at this case, and wouldn't you know it, after paying that expert all that money, the expert decided that it's not necessarily a homicide. Okay? And you could also say things like, if this is the case, again, I don't know the details of the case, but if this happens, and I know it happens sometimes in my cases, you say, and you're also going to hear evidence about what medical records or what reports were provided to that expert. And you're going to hear also evidence about certain reports that were not provided to that expert before that expert came to that opinion. So after that expert was getting paid all this money, they still didn't want to send them certain reports that our expert actually did see. So that's just a way that you're letting the jury know there is an expert that's going to come in and say something different, but you're already painting it in a light that shows that your expert is much more credible than their expert. And you're not arguing it, you're just mentioning it. And that's how you do it. So that was another thing. And also the fact that Tammy Daybell's kids are going to testify about Tammy's health and that she did suffer from different sicknesses and she wouldn't refuse to go to doctors. That's something you also should dispel in your opening statement as a prosecutor. They probably know that. They probably know what the kids are going to testify about. So then they should say something to the effect of, you're going to hear testimony from Tammy's children that she was one of these people who didn't like going to the doctor. And she didn't. But you're also going to see evidence that there's no ER visits. There's no emergencies that she had. She was never feeling any sort of pain, or she never had any issues before. You're going to be hearing all that type of evidence also. At least that way you're able to tell the jury about it, embrace the weaknesses of your case, and then you're also explaining, without arguing, you're explaining how the evidence is going to show how that's not really going to make a difference in the ultimate determination of this case. Now, that's in terms of why I felt like the prosecutor should have anticipated these arguments or these statements that the defense is going to make and address them. Now, also, the defense conveniently also did not address certain things. So, for example, some of the things that the defense did not address was why, if Tammy Daybell's death was just so sudden, and this has nothing to do with any plan to be with Lori, why 17 days later would you go get married in Hawaii? This is your wife of 29 years. Now, you're right, you're having an affair. You shouldn't be having an affair, and you're crazy about Lori, and, but you didn't do this. And you're going to get married 17 days later. So that just really doesn't look good. That's number one. Number two, what about the text message of the dead raccoon? The defense didn't make any mention about that text message. Number three, what about the fact that Tammy suddenly died right after her life insurance was raised to $400,000, which Chad cashed in on almost immediately after her death? Doesn't that show that he had something to do with her death? But the defense attorney did not address that either. Also, the rental application with no kids, that he wrote that there was no kids. Also, that no kids were reported missing. So that's a few things that the defense attorney did not argue. There is, you can't argue everything. And again, like as the defense attorney in this case, there is a lot of evidence against you. So you may not want to try to address everything during opening statements and see how the evidence comes in. But I think anything that was mentioned by the prosecutor, you got to have some sort of response when you're getting up there as a defense attorney. Also, obviously something that was very lacking in both the prosecutor and the defense attorney's opening statements was the burden of proof. Nobody talked about the burden of proof. The prosecutor didn't talk about the burden of proof, and the defense attorney did not talk about the burden of proof. And again, like I always say, and by this point, I'm a broken record, you got to talk about the burden of proof. Tell that to the jury how high of a burden this is. From the defense attorney and as prosecutor, you got to embrace it, and that's something that they both did not do. So that is my analysis on the opening statements in this case. We'll be continuing, hopefully, to follow this case. It's not terribly easy to watch or listen to because of the lack of cameras in the room and however they're recording it. But we'll do our best to follow it, and we will bring you the analysis afterwards. So thanks for watching. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, like the video, and we will see you next time.